By the second week of January 1985, Jean Besson had become the cautionary tale that Wayne County, Ohio, told itself about women who sold too early. Soybeans were at $7.20 a bushel and still climbing. Jean had forward contracted her entire crop in October at $6.10. The elevator had processed the delivery in November. The check had cleared. The money was gone in the only direction it could go: to the bank, to the landlord, to the seed company, to the propane bill that had been sitting on the counter since September. By January, she was finished with the 1984 crop, and the market was offering $1.10 more than she had taken, and every person she ran into in Worcester seemed to know it. At the grain elevator, on a Monday morning in the second week of January, a man named Art Wessner, who farmed 640 acres north of Shreve and had stored his entire soybean crop in a rented bin through the fall, said it in a way that left no room for interpretation. "She left $1.10 on the table," he said to the man standing next to him, and he said it at a volume that was not quite loud enough to be rude, but was certainly loud enough to be heard. His 28,000 bushels, valued at $7.20, were looking like the smartest decision anyone in the county had made since September. Jean paid for her account balance at the counter and drove back to the farm without responding to Art Wessner, or to the arithmetic he was carrying around like a trophy. She had heard variations of the same number from 3 different people in the previous week, and she had the same response each time, which was no response at all. Not because she didn't have one, because the response required more explanation than a grain elevator lobby would accommodate, and because the explanation started in October, not January. Here's what Art Wessner didn't know. Here's what Jean had known since the last week of September, when she had driven to the Farm Bureau office in Worcester and sat down with a legal pad and a pencil and worked through the numbers the way she had been working through farm numbers since she took over the operation from her father in 1979. To understand the decision Jean made in October, you have to go back to the spring of 1984, because that's when the season started, and that's when the obligations were set. And the obligations are what make the October decision make sense. Jean farmed 380 acres in Wayne County, mostly soybeans in rotation with winter wheat, on ground her father had bought in 2 parcels over the 1960s. The land was owned outright, no mortgage, no land note, which was the single most important fact about her financial position. But the operating costs of farming 380 acres were not small, and she funded them the way most farmers funded them, with a spring operating loan that she drew in March and retired in November after harvest. Her operating loan for 1984 was $54,000, drawn from First Federal Savings in Worcester at 16% annual interest. The rate had been higher the year before and had come down somewhat, but 16% on $54,000 was still $8,640 in annual interest, $720 per month, running from March forward, compounding against her whether the beans cooperated or not. By late September, her soybeans were in the field and looking like a decent crop. Not exceptional. The August rains had been adequate, but not generous, and her yield estimate was coming in around 36 bushels per acre on the bean ground, which was close to her 5-year average. Call it 10,800 bushels on the acres she had in production. The cash price at the Worcester elevator in late September was $6.05 per bushel. October futures were trading around $6.15. The market had been climbing since summer on the back of strong export demand and a tighter than expected crop in the western corn belt. People at the Farm Bureau were talking about $7 soybeans by spring. Here's what Jean wrote on the legal pad. Operating loan balance as of October 1st, with 7 months of interest, $57,040. Land rent on the leased portion of her operation, 120 acres she was renting from a retired neighbor, $9,600, due November 30th. Seed deposit for the 1985 wheat crop, required by December 15th, $3,200. Propane and heating costs through winter, estimated $1,800. Personal expenses minimum $6,400 through March. Total obligations before spring, 1985. Planting, $78,040. At $6.10 per bushel on 10,800 bushels, her gross crop revenue was $65,880. After paying the operating loan, the land rent, the seed deposit, the propane, and the personal minimum, she would have $65,880 minus $78,040. That was negative $12,160. She wrote that number and looked at it. Then she added the 2 lines below it on the legal pad that clarified what it actually meant. Her land was unencumbered. She could borrow against it. She had a relationship with First Federal that was clean and current. She could cover a $12,000 shortfall by drawing on her equity line. But drawing on the equity line meant entering the 1985 planting season already in the hole, with a negative starting position that would compound against her if the 1985 crop was also thin. And there was a more immediate problem. The land rent was due November 30th, and the seed deposit December 15th, and those were not obligations that could wait for a spring rally that might or might not arrive before anyone needed to plant. She wrote the break-even calculation below the total obligations. $78,040 divided by 10,800 bushels equaled $7.23 per bushel. That was what she needed to net from her crop, not to make money, just to clear every obligation through spring. The market in late September was at $6.05. It was $1.18 below break-even. The question she was sitting with was not whether to sell at $6.05. The question was whether she should forward contract at $6.10, locking in a price that was still $1.13 below her full break-even, or wait for the market to move. Here's how she thought about it, which is different from how the grain elevator lobby understood it in January. At $6.10, she couldn't cover all her obligations from the crop alone. She would still need to draw approximately $12,000 from the equity line, but she could pay the bank, the landlord, and the seed company on schedule and enter 1985 with a known, manageable deficit rather than an unknown one. At $7 or $7.20, she could cover everything from the crop and carry nothing into spring. The question was what the market needed to do, and by when, for the higher price to be worth waiting for. Carrying cost on 10,800 bushels from October through March, commercial storage at $0.04 per bushel per month, plus the continuing interest on the operating loan, ran approximately $2,500 per month. If soybeans reached $7 in December after 2 months of carrying costs, her net effective price was $7 minus 8 cents in storage, minus the interest that had continued to run, approximately $6.84. Better than $6.10, meaningfully better, and worth waiting for if the price got there. But if beans reached $7 in February, after 5 months of carrying, her net effective price was closer to $6.65. And if they reached $7 in April, after 6 months of storage and continued interest, she was at $6.52, still above $6.10, but the gap had narrowed considerably. She also needed to know whether the market was going to hit $7 or $7.20 at all, which nobody knew, and whether it would hold there long enough to sell into, which also nobody knew, and whether her landlord would extend the November 30th deadline if the spring rally came in March instead of December, which she already knew the answer to. He would not. The lease was clear on dates. She forward contracted on a Thursday in the first week of October, delivery through November 15th at $6.10. She called the elevator that afternoon, confirmed the contract, and drove home. She told her neighbour, Marguerite Howell, what she'd done over coffee that Saturday, and Marguerite said she thought beans were going higher, and that Jean might regret locking in. Jean said she might. She said she had run the numbers and that $6.10 was the price that let her pay her bills, and that $7.20 was a possibility she couldn't afford to chase. Marguerite had stored her beans. In November and December, soybeans continued to climb. The export demand that analysts had been citing held through the fall, and by mid-December, the cash price in Worcester had reached $6.90. By the first week of January, it had crossed $7 and kept moving. Art Westner and the other men who had stored their crop through harvest were feeling the specific satisfaction of watching a bet pay off, and they were not quiet about it. The coffee shop conversation in Worcester that January ran toward predictions of $7.50 by spring, toward discussions of which bins were still holding beans, and what price they were targeting, toward the occasional reference to people who had sold too early, and what that had cost them. The culture in Wayne County in early 1985 was the culture of a market that had moved in the right direction long enough for people to feel certain about it. That certainty is a real thing when it happens, not irrational, not manufactured, but a genuine consensus built from watching a number climb for 14 weeks and finding reasons each week why it was likely to keep climbing. The export demand was real. The supply estimates were tighter than usual. The analysts who covered the soybean market professionally were publishing projections that pointed upward. The people holding beans in January 1985 had good reasons for what they were doing, the same way the people who had stored corn in Fillmore County, Minnesota in November 1983 had good reasons for what they were doing, right up until February arrived, and the reasons stopped mattering as much as the price on the board. Jean had thought about this in December when beans crossed $6.90, and she found herself recalculating what she had walked away from. She had not done this to torture herself. She had done it because she needed to know whether she had made a mistake or whether she had made a decision, and the difference mattered for how she would approach the next harvest season. What she concluded after running the December numbers was that she had made a decision at a price that solved a specific problem, and that a different price would have required a different set of conditions she hadn't been able to guarantee in October. Jean was not in those conversations. She had cleared her operating loan in November, paid the land rent on time, made the seed deposit in December, and entered January with her obligations current and a $12,000 draw on the equity line that she was planning to retire from the 1985 crop income. She was not comfortable. She was not sitting on a surplus. She was watching $7.20 soybeans on the elevator board and doing the arithmetic on what she had left on the table. which came to $11,880 in foregone revenue on her 10,800 bushels. She wrote that number down. Then she wrote the carrying cost that Art Wessner had not written down, which was $0.04 per bushel per month for 5 months of storage, plus the continuing operating loan interest that had been running since March. His carrying cost to reach January from October was approximately 0.20 per bushel. His net effective price at $7.20 with 5 months of carrying costs was $7. She had taken $6.10. He was at $7. The real gap was 90 cents, not $1.10, still real, still money, but not the number on the napkin. Then February arrived. The USDA crop report in the first week of February showed soybean ending stocks larger than the market had expected. Brazil's harvest was coming in strong. Export inspections for the week came in at 18 million bushels against trade expectations of 26 million. The dollar had been strengthening since November, and the gap in price between American soybeans and South American soybeans on world markets had been quietly narrowing in a way that wasn't obvious until the export numbers confirmed it. Soybeans broke from $7.20 to $6.90 in 3 days. They kept moving. By Valentine's Day, the cash price in Worcester was $5.80. Art Wessner sold in the third week of February at $5.85. He had paid 6 months of commercial storage on 28,000 bushels, which came to $6,720, and his operating loan had continued to run through the same period. His net effective price after those costs was approximately $5.44 per bushel. He had watched a number move from $6.10 to $7.20 and back to $5.44, and his patience had cost him 66 cents a bushel against what Jean had taken in October. He did not discuss this at the grain elevator. Marguerite Howell sold in February at $5.80. Her carrying costs put her at a net effective price of about $5.50. She called Jean that week and said she supposed Jean had been right in October, and Jean said she hadn't known in October that February would look like this. She had known that $6.10 paid her bills, and that the cost of waiting for something better was real and running, and that had been enough. Here's what this story is not about. It is not about a woman who saw the soybean market more clearly than the men who mocked her in January. Jean Besson did not predict February. She did not know in October that the spring rally wouldn't come. Nobody in Wayne County knew that. The men who stored were not wrong to think beans could go higher. They did go higher for 2.5 months, and the prediction was correct right up until it wasn't. What Jean had done in October was not a market call, it was a solvency calculation. She had identified the price that kept the operation intact through winter and contracted at the first opportunity to lock it in, because the alternative was a gamble she couldn't afford to lose. Not because losing was certain, because losing was possible, and the cost of losing was the land rent unpaid, and the seed deposit missed, and the 1985 season starting from behind. She had not timed the market. She had chosen the farm over the rally. There is a version of this story where Jean is the hero and Art Wessner is the cautionary tale, and by March 1985, the arithmetic supported that version. But that's not quite what happened, and it's not quite what
Jean understood had happened. Art had made a market call that was correct for 14 weeks and wrong in the 15th. He had accepted carrying costs and exposure in exchange for the possibility of a better price, and the possibility had been real. $7.20 was real. not a rumor, not a projection. He had lost not because he had been reckless, but because February had arrived before he sold. There is a line between a bad decision and a good decision that went wrong, and Art was on one side of it, while Jane was on the other. But the line is thinner than the January coffee shop made it appear. What John had understood in October was not that Art would lose. She had understood that she couldn't afford to find out either way. Jean Besson farmed that Wayne County ground for another 21 years. She sold her beans at harvest most years, or forward contracted in October when the operating loan math required it, and she stored when her cash position gave her the cushion to wait, and when the carrying cost calculation supported holding. She did not develop a philosophy about spring rallies. She developed a habit of writing down the break-even before she decided what to do with the crop. In October, John chose the farm over the rally. By February, that looked like wisdom. But in December, when Art Westner was doing his arithmetic on a napkin and soybeans were at $7.20 and climbing, it looked like neither.